My wife looked me in the eye and said she wanted the house, the cars, the art collection, everything except our son. My lawyer begged me to fight to drag her through court for every penny. Instead, I looked at her valid demands and said, "Give it all to her." Everyone thought I had lost my mind, or that old age had finally made me soft. At the final hearing, I signed over assets worth millions without blinking. She smiled that victorious shark-like smile she used when she spent my money. She thought she had stripped me bare until her lawyer leaned in and whispered 5 words that turned her face ghost white. She had no idea she was standing on a trapdoor I built 20 years ago. But before I tell you how she lost everything, let me take you back to the morning my life shattered. If you have ever felt the cold steel of betrayal from the person who sleeps next to you, hit the like button and subscribe because this story is for you. It started on a Tuesday morning in Malibu. The Pacific Ocean was calm that day, a sheet of gray steel stretching out to the horizon visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of our breakfast nook. I was 70 years old, and I had spent 40 of those years building an empire of concrete and glass across America so that I could sit right here and drink my Colombian dark roast in peace. The silence in the house was usually my favorite part of the day. But that morning, the air felt heavy, almost electrical, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. I was buttering a piece of toast, listening to the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the pillars of our deck, when the silence was broken not by a greeting, but by a heavy thud. A thick manila envelope landed directly on my plate, cracking the porcelain and sending my coffee flying across the table. The dark liquid soaked into the Italian silk tablecloth, spreading like a fresh bruise. I did not jump. I did not yell. In the real estate game, panic is the first sign of weakness, so I simply picked up my linen napkin and began to dab at the spill, calmly watching the brown stain expand. I looked up. Veronica stood on the other side of the table. She was 48 years old and beautiful in that sharp, manufactured way that costs $10,000 a month to maintain. She was wearing her tennis whites, even though I knew she hadn't played a set of tennis in 3 years. Her eyes were hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses, but I could feel the coldness radiating from them. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not apologize for the mess. She simply crossed her arms and said, "Harrison, I am done. I want a divorce." I slowly placed the soiled napkin on the table. I had sensed this coming for months. The late nights, the whispered phone calls, the way she pulled away every time I tried to touch her hand. But hearing it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. I took a breath and asked her what brought this on. She laughed a dry, humorless sound. "Look at you, Harrison. You are old. You are tired. You want to sit here and watch the waves and talk about history. I am still young. I have life to live, and I am tired of playing nursemaid to a man who is past his prime. I want my freedom." I nodded slowly, processing her words. She was right about the age gap. I never hid my age. When we married 10 years ago, she said she loved my maturity. She said she loved my wisdom. Now it seems she only loved the lifestyle my maturity could afford. I asked her what she wanted. She pointed a manicured finger at the envelope on the table. "It is all in there. My lawyers drafted it last night. I want this house in Malibu. It is my style, not yours anyway. I want the penthouse in Tribeca because I need a base in New York for Fashion Week. I want the vintage Porsche collection because, frankly, you are too slow to drive them anymore. And I want a lump sum cash settlement of $5 million. I looked at the house around me. This structure of steel and glass was worth $15 million easily. The penthouse was worth another 10. The cars were priceless. She was asking for nearly 80% of my liquid assets and property. She was trying to skin me alive. Most men would have exploded. They would have thrown the table over. They would have screamed about loyalty and gratitude. But I am not most men. I learned a long time ago that in a negotiation, the person who speaks first loses, and the person who shows emotion dies. I looked at the coffee stain, which had stopped spreading. I asked her a simple question. A question that should have been the first thing on her mind. What about Leo? Leo was our 16-year-old son. He was a quiet, sensitive boy who loved music and books more than business. He had my eyes and, unfortunately, his mother's insecurity. He worshipped Veronica, always trying to get her attention, always trying to be the cool son she wanted, but she always treated him like an accessory that had gone out of style. Veronica sighed, the kind of sigh one makes when asked to do a tedious chore like taking out the trash. She adjusted her sunglasses and said, "That is the other thing, Harrison. You keep him." The air left the room. I felt my hands curl into fists under the table. I asked her to repeat herself, hoping I had misunderstood. She shrugged casually, picking at a piece of lint on her pristine white skirt. I said, "You keep the boy." Leo is 16, Harrison. He is practically an adult. He is moody. He is socially awkward, and frankly, he is depressing to be around. He drags me down. I am starting a new chapter, a vibrant, exciting chapter. I cannot be dragging a brooding teenager around Europe. He is too much like you. He is heavy. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a rage so cold it burned. She was discarding our son like he was a piece of furniture that didn't match her new decor. She wanted the house, the cars, the money, but the flesh and blood. Human being we created was just baggage. At that exact moment, the sliding glass door to the patio slid open. Leo was standing there. He was wearing his oversized headphones around his neck, holding a book. His face was pale. He had heard. He had heard his mother call him a burden. He had heard her trade him for a penthouse. Leo looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and devastation. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the woman who had given birth to him, waiting for her to say, it was a joke, waiting for her to say she didn't mean it. Veronica turned and saw him. For a split second, I thought she might show shame. I thought she might try to cover it up. But she didn't. She looked at him with the same indifference she showed the spilled coffee. She said, "Do not look at me like that, Leo. It is not a tragedy. Your father has plenty of money. He will hire the best nannies or tutors or whatever you need. You will be better off with him. I am not cut out to be a mother anymore. I have done my time." Leo dropped his book. It hit the deck with a hollow slap. He looked at me, his eyes filling with tears, and then he turned and ran. He ran down the steps toward the beach, disappearing behind the dunes. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. For the first time in 20 years, the mask of the calm businessman slipped. I looked at Veronica, and I saw her for what she truly was. Not a wife, not a partner, not even a mother. She was a parasite, a creature that attached itself, fed until it was full, and then moved on, leaving a hollow shell behind. She checked her diamond watch, a watch I bought her for our 5th anniversary. "I have a brunch appointment at the club," she said, adjusting her bag. "Have your lawyers call my lawyers, Harrison. Let's make this quick. I want to be in New York by the weekend." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her tennis shoes squeaking on the marble floor. She didn't look back at the beach where her son was crying. She didn't look back at the husband she was destroying. She just walked out into the California sunshine, thinking she had won the lottery. I stood alone in the silence of the $15 million house she claimed was hers. I looked at the coffee stain on the silk. Ruined. Just like this marriage. Just like this life I thought I had built. But as I watched her car pull out of the driveway, a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of a general who realizes the enemy has just made a fatal mistake. She had attacked my money, and I could have forgiven that. She had attacked my pride, and I could have ignored that. But she had attacked my son. She had broken his heart and called him garbage, and that was a declaration of war. I picked up my phone. I did not call a therapist. I did not call a friend to cry on their shoulder. I dialed the number of Sarah Jenkins, my attorney, a woman who was known in legal circles as the Iron Maiden. She answered on the first ring. Harrison, good morning. I spoke quietly, but my voice was as hard as the granite countertop. Sarah, I need you to prepare divorce papers. Veronica wants everything. The Malibu house, the New York apartment, the cars. Sarah gasped. Harrison, we will fight her. We will bury her. She will not get a dime. No, Sarah. I said, my eyes fixed on the spot where my son had disappeared. You are going to draft the agreement exactly as she wants it. Give her the house. Give her the apartment. Give her the cars. Give her every single thing she asked for. Harrison, have you lost your mind? Sarah shouted. Do it, I said, cutting her off. But I want one clause added. Just one. And it must be non-negotiable. She must sign away all parental rights and all future claims to any assets connected to Leo. Total severance. There was a silence on the line. Then Sarah spoke, her voice confused. Harrison, you are handing her an empire for nothing. I looked out at the ocean. The tide was going out, pulling everything with it. I am not handing her an empire, Sarah, I said. I am handing her a rope. She just doesn't know it yet. Get the papers ready. I want this done fast. I hung up the phone. I walked out to the deck and looked down at the beach. I saw Leo sitting on a piece of driftwood, his head in his hands. I walked down the stairs, my old knees aching with every step. I sat down beside him. I didn't say anything. I just put my arm around his shaking shoulders and held him while he cried for the mother who had just thrown him away. And as I held him, I made a promise to the universe. Veronica Clark thought she was taking everything. She thought she was walking away with the kingdom. But she had forgotten the most important rule of real estate. Always check the foundation, because she didn't know that the ground she was so eager to stand on didn't belong to her. It never had. And when the time was right, I was going to pull it out from under her feet and watch her fall. Leo stood frozen in the frame of the sliding glass door, and the silence that followed Veronica's declaration was heavy enough to crush bones. He looked small for 16. His shoulders hunched inward, as if trying to make himself invisible, a defense mechanism he had perfected over years of living with a mother who viewed him as a flaw in her perfect life. I saw the exact moment his heart broke. It wasn't a dramatic explosion or a scream. It was a subtle dimming of the light in his eyes, a resignation that no child should ever have to feel. He looked from her to me, his chest heaving, waiting for her to take it back, waiting for her to say that, of course, she wanted him, that he was the priority. But Veronica did not step forward. She did not reach out. She simply sighed, a sound of annoyance rather than regret, and reached for her mimosa. Harrison, please handle him, she said, waving a hand dismissively towards our son. I cannot deal with teenage angst right now. I have a schedule to keep. I stepped between them, my body acting as a shield, though I knew the damage was already done. Words are like bullets once they are fired, but you cannot call them back, and she had just shot him point blank in the heart. Leo. I started, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. Your mother is just upset. She doesn't mean it. But Veronica, cruel, beautiful Veronica, couldn't even let him have that small mercy. She set her glass down hard on the table, the crystal clinking sharply. Stop coddling him, Harrison, she snapped, her voice cutting through the humid ocean air. Don't make that face at me, Leo. I am not a monster. I am a realist. I am not a nanny, and I am certainly not a jailer. You are 16 years old. You don't need a mother hovering over you. You need resources. Your father has money. He has connections. He will hire people to look after you, people who are paid to deal with your moods. I have done my duty. I gave you life. Now I need to go live mine. The brutality of it was breathtaking. She spoke of our son as if he were a contract she had fulfilled, a subscription she was canceling because she found a better offer elsewhere. Leo let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He didn't look at me. He spun around, his sneakers screeching against the polished deck, and he ran. He didn't run toward the beach this time. He ran toward the front of the house, toward the driveway. "Leo, wait!" I shouted, ignoring the ache in my hip as I scrambled after him. I chased him through the sprawling living room, past the grand piano he used to play, before she told him it gave her a headache, past the white leather sofas we weren't allowed to sit on. I burst out the front door just in time to see him throwing himself into the passenger seat of my old Ford truck, the one vehicle Veronica refused to ride in because it smelled of dust and hard work. He slammed the door and locked it, curling into a ball against the window. His headphones pulled tight over his ears, as if to block out the world that had just rejected him. I reached the truck, breathless, my hand slapping against the window. "Leo-san, open the door. Please." He wouldn't look at me. He just shook his head, burying his face in his knees. I stood there in the driveway of my $15 million estate, feeling more helpless than I ever had when I was a poor contractor mixing cement by hand. I could buy buildings, I could reshape skylines, but I couldn't buy the pain out of my son's chest. I stayed there for a moment, my hand resting on the warm metal of the truck, promising him silently that I would fix this. I didn't know how yet, but I would fix it. I turned back toward the house. The morning sun glared off the white stucco, blinding and sharp. I walked back inside. The house was quiet again. I expected to find Veronica packing, or perhaps crying, maybe realizing the enormity of what she had just done. I walked into the kitchen. She was standing by the island, her phone pressed to her ear, examining her fingernails with critical precision. "Yes? I need an appointment for 2 o'clock, she was saying into the phone, her voice light and airy, completely devoid of the venom she had just spewed. "No, not a fill, just a gel polish. And I need a pedicure too. I'm going to New York this weekend, and I need to look perfect. Yes, charge it to the black card." She looked up and saw me standing there. She didn't flinch. She didn't hang up. She just pointed to the coffee stain on the table and mouthed the word mess before turning her back to me to continue her conversation about cuticle oil. That was the moment. That was the exact second. The last ember of affection I held for her turned into cold, gray ash. It wasn't the greed. I was used to greed in my business. It was the absolute sociopathic indifference. She had just orphaned her son emotionally, and her biggest concern was the shade of her toenail polish. I didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say to her. I walked past her, past the smell of her expensive perfume, which now smelled like decay to me, and went straight to my study. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it. This room was my sanctuary. It was lined with books and blueprints, the history of my life's work. I sat down behind my desk, the leather chair creaking familiarly. My hands were shaking not from age but from the adrenaline of pure focused fury. I reached for the secure landline I kept for business dealings that required absolute discretion. I dialed Sarah Jenkins. She picked up on the second ring. "Harrison. I was just reviewing the preliminary asset list. We have a strategy meeting scheduled for Thursday, but given the circumstances, I think we should—" "Stop," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and metallic. "There will be no strategy meeting, Sarah." "Harrison, what happened?" she asked, her tone shifting instantly from lawyer to friend. "She told Leo," I said, staring at the wall where a framed photo of my son hung. "She told him to his face that he was a burden. She told him I should hire people to deal with him because she was done. She is booking a manicure right now, Sarah. She is in the kitchen booking a manicure while our son is crying in the driveway." There was a silence on the line, heavy and stunned. Sarah had known us for years. She knew Veronica was difficult, but this was a new level of depravity. "My God, Harrison," Sarah breathed. "I am so sorry. We will destroy her. I will file for full custody on grounds of emotional abuse. We will tie her up in litigation for years. She won't see a dime of alimony." "No," I said, cutting her off. That is the old way. That takes too long. Leo needs this over now. He needs her out of his life before she can do any more damage. Then what do you want to do? Sarah asked. I took a deep breath, looking at the safe in the corner of the room. The safe that held the documents Veronica thought were just boring old deeds and contracts. Prepare the settlement agreement, I commanded. Give her everything she asked for. The Malibu house, the Tribeca penthouse, the vintage Porsches, the art collection, the liquid cash. Give it all to her. Harrison, you cannot be serious. Sarah shouted, her professional demeanor cracking. That is nearly 80% of your net worth. You are angry. You are not thinking clearly. You cannot just hand over $100 million worth of assets to that woman. I am thinking more clearly than I ever have in my life, I replied. I don't want to fight her for the house, Sarah. I want her to have it. I want her to have the keys in her hand. I want her to sign the papers thinking she has won the lottery. But why, Sarah asked, her voice trembling with frustration. Because I need her to sign one specific document, I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. In exchange for the assets, I want her to sign a full and irrevocable waiver of all parental rights and any future claim to Leo's estate or guardianship. I want her to legally sever herself from him. She wants freedom. I will give her so much freedom she will choke on it. Harrison, even if she signs that giving her the properties is financial suicide, she wins. Does she? I asked. Sarah, do you remember the Phoenix Project from '98? There was a long pause. I could hear the gears turning in Sarah's brilliant legal mind. The Phoenix Project. That was the restructuring of the land trusts. But Harrison, that was decades ago. What does that have to? Her voice trailed off. I heard the sharp intake of breath as the realization hit her. Oh my God, Sarah whispered. The land leases. Exactly, I said. The leases expire at midnight on the day the divorce is finalized. But Harrison, she stammered, if the leases expire, and she owns the structures, but not the land, then she is trespassing, I finished for her. Sarah started to laugh. It was a nervous, incredulous laugh. Harrison, that is diabolical. She will be ruined. The tax implications alone. Do it, I said. Draw up the papers. Make them look standard. Let her lawyers think I am just a broken old man giving up. Let them think they crushed me. I want her to sign as fast as possible. I will have the draft ready by tonight. Sarah said, her voice now sharp with the thrill of the hunt. I hung up the phone. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, down in the driveway, I could see the silhouette of my son sitting in the truck. I am not giving up, Leo, I whispered to the glass. I am just clearing the battlefield. I walked out of the study and back into the hallway. I could hear Veronica humming in the bedroom, the sound of zippers closing as she packed her designer suitcases. She was happy. She thought the war was over. She had no idea that I had just armed the bomb that would blow her world apart. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor of the Jenkins & Associates building was silent and swift. A silver bullet shooting straight into the sky. I stepped out into the lobby, which smelled of expensive leather and old money, a scent I used to find comforting, but today felt like the air inside a tomb. I walked past the receptionist who nodded with that pitying look people give you when they know you are about to lose everything. I didn't stop. I pushed open the double glass doors to Sarah Jenkins' office and walked into a storm. Sarah was not sitting behind her desk. She was standing by the window, pacing like a caged tiger. When she saw me, she didn't say hello. She slammed a stack of documents onto her mahogany conference table with a force that made the heavy wood vibrate. "You are out of your mind, Harrison," she shouted, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "I have been your attorney for 25 years. I have watched you dismantle competitors. I have watched you negotiate deals that changed the skyline of this city. And now you walk in here and tell me to hand over 80% of your net worth to a woman who is treating you like a discarded shoe. Have you lost your senses? I closed the door quietly behind me and walked to the table. The documents were there. The deed to the Malibu estate, the title transfer for the Tribeca penthouse, the registration papers for the 1964 Porsche 911, and the rest of the vintage fleet. It was a king's ransom laid out on white paper. "Sit down, Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady. "I will not sit down," she fired back, her face flushed with frustration. "Do you understand what you are asking me to do? You are asking me to facilitate the biggest robbery in the history of this firm. We have grounds to fight her, Harrison. We can prove infidelity. I have investigators who can link her to that tennis instructor in West Hollywood. We can drag this out. We can force her to settle for a fraction of this. Why are you surrendering?" I pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. I picked up the deed to the Malibu house. It felt heavy in my hand. I looked at the legal description of the property, the metes and bounds that defined the boundaries of my home. "I am not surrendering, Sarah," I said, looking up at her. "I am concluding a business transaction." "Business transaction," she scoffed, throwing her hands in the air. "She is taking you for everything. The house alone is worth $15 million. The art inside is worth another $5 million. The cars, the New York property. Harrison, this is generational wealth you are signing away. And for what? To get her out of your hair a few months sooner." "No," I said. "To get her out of Leo's life forever." Sarah stopped pacing. She leaned her hands on the table and looked at me, her eyes searching mine for some sign of the man she used to know. "Harrison," she said, her voice softer now, but still urgent. "I drafted the waiver you asked for, the one where she relinquishes all rights to Leo. But you don't need to give her $100 million to get her to sign it. She doesn't want the boy. She told you that. She will sign it for a lot less." "She might," I admitted. "Or she might use him as leverage. She might realize that Leo is the only thing I truly care about, and she might hold his custody hostage to squeeze more money out of me later. She might drag him through court appearances and custody evaluations just to spite me. I cannot risk that, Sarah. I need her to sign that waiver today. I need her to look at this pile of assets and be so blinded by greed that she doesn't even read the fine print regarding her son. I need her to think she has won so completely that she doesn't look over her shoulder." Sarah shook her head, sinking into her chair. "It is reckless, Harrison. It is emotional. You are letting your heart make financial decisions, and that is the first rule you taught me never to do." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Chicago lay spread out below us, a grid of gray and steel under a flat winter sky. I looked down at the tiny cars moving like ants on the highway. I remember when I bought my first major plot of land in the '80s, I said, keeping my back to her. It was a swamp in Florida. Everyone told me it was worthless. The seller was laughing when he signed the deal. He thought he had scammed a young, naive developer. He thought he had unloaded a burden on a fool. I turned back to face her. He didn't know that I had seen the municipal surveys. He didn't know the state was planning to build a highway interchange a mile away. He was so busy counting his small victory that he didn't see the empire I was about to build on that mud. Sarah stared at me, her brow furrowed. "What is your point, Harrison?" "My point is that sometimes to trap a big beast you have to use the biggest bait," I said. "You cannot catch a shark with a worm, Sarah. You have to throw a side of beef in the water. You have to let the shark think it is feeding. You have to let it taste the blood." She looked down at the papers. "This isn't a side of beef, Harrison. This is the whole cow. You are relying on a 20-year-old land lease structure that hasn't been tested in court in a divorce proceeding. If the judge decides that the house and the land are inseparable because of the duration of the marriage, you lose. If Veronica's lawyers find a loophole in the trust documents, you lose. You are betting everything on a technicality. I am betting on her greed, I corrected. I am betting that she is so arrogant, so convinced of her own superiority, that she won't bother to check the foundation of what she is taking. She sees the mansion Sarah. She sees the marble floors and the ocean view. She doesn't see the ground beneath her feet. Sarah picked up a pen. She twirled it in her fingers, her knuckles white. I hate this, Harrison. I want this on the record. I am advising you against this. I think it is a mistake. I think you are angry and hurting, and you are going to wake up in a rental apartment with nothing but a used truck and regret it. I smiled a thin, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. I will have Leo, I said. And that is not nothing. Now are the papers ready? Sarah sighed a long, defeated sound. She opened a folder and pushed it toward me. Here, she said. The transfer deeds, the settlement agreement, the waiver of parental rights. It is all here, everything she asked for. I picked up my fountain pen. The gold nib glinted in the office light. I looked at the first document. Transfer of title, 1088 Malibu Road. I didn't hesitate. I signed my name in fluid black ink. Harrison Clark. I flipped the page. Transfer of title. Tribeca Penthouse Unit 4B. I signed again. Page after page. I signed away the collection of vintage cars I had spent 30 years assembling. I signed away the paintings I had bought at auction in London and Paris. I signed away the cash reserves. Sarah watched me in silence, her face pale. She looked like she was witnessing a suicide. When I reached the last document, I paused. It was the waiver. The document that would legally erase Veronica from Leo's life. It stated that she voluntarily terminated her parental rights, that she ceded full legal and physical custody to me, and that she waived any right to contest my estate or Leo's future trust. I tapped the paper. This one, I said. Make sure this one is on top when you send the package to her lawyer. Make sure it is the first thing she sees after the check. I will, Sarah whispered. I capped my pen and placed it on the table. The sound was like a gavel striking. It is done, I said. Send it to Richard Sterling. Tell him I capitulated. Tell him I am old and tired and I just want it to be over. Tell him he won. Sarah gathered the papers, her hands shaking slightly. You are a terrifying man, Harrison Clark, she said. I buttoned my jacket and walked toward the door. Not yet, Sarah, I said without looking back. Not yet. But I am about to be. I walked out of the office and back into the elevator. As the numbers counted down, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. I had just given away my fortune. I was technically poorer than I had been since I was 22 years old. But as I walked out into the cold Chicago wind, I didn't feel poor. I felt dangerous. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It was a direct line to the trustee department of the First National Bank, the division that handled specialized, irrevocable trusts. This is Arthur, a dusty voice answered. Arthur. This is Harrison Clark, I said, watching the traffic flow by. Mr. Clark, it has been a long time. It has, I said. I am calling to confirm the status of the Phoenix Trust. Specifically, the ground leases for the Malibu and New York properties. There was a typing sound on the other end. Yes, I have the file right here. The leases were established in 1998 with a 25-year term. And the expiration date I asked, though I knew the answer by heart. Arthur paused. They expire tomorrow at midnight, Mr. Clark. Would you like to initiate the renewal process? The terms allow for a renewal at fair market value or... No, Arthur, I cut him off. Do not renew them. There was a silence on the line. I beg your pardon, Mr. Clark. If you do not renew, the trust is legally obligated to issue an eviction notice or demand a new lease at current commercial rates. the improvements on the land, the houses. They become liabilities to the structure owner if they don't have a valid ground lease. I know, Arthur, I said, watching a seagull fight against the wind. That is exactly the point. Prepare the notices. I want them served at 1 minute past midnight tomorrow. But sir, who is the current owner of the structures, the notice must be served to the title holder of the house. As of this afternoon, I said, my voice cold and satisfied. The owner is Veronica Clark. Send the bill to her. I hung up the phone. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all I had to do was wait for the snap. The conference room at Sterling & Partners was designed to intimidate. It was all chrome and glass perched high above the city like a vulture's nest. I sat on one side of the long frosted glass table, with Sarah next to me. On the other side sat Veronica and Richard Sterling. Richard was a man who smiled too much. He had teeth that looked like they had been bought from a catalog, and a tan that came from a bottle. He wore a suit that cost more than my first car, but wore it with the grace of a used car salesman. He was flipping through the settlement agreement Sarah had sent over. Every time he turned a page, he made a little humming sound of satisfaction. He was enjoying this. He thought he had broken me. He thought he was dissecting a whale that had beached itself voluntarily. This all looks in order, Harrison Richard said, not bothering to look up. You have agreed to the transfer of the primary residence in Malibu. You have agreed to the transfer of the Tribeca property, the vehicles, the art. It is a very generous offer. Surprisingly generous given the circumstances. He looked up, then his eyes narrowing slightly. He was looking for the catch. He was a predator, and predators know that meals rarely come free. But I gave him nothing. I sat with my hands folded on the table, my face a mask of weary resignation. I just want this over, Richard, I said. I am 70 years old. I don't have the energy for a war. I want peace. Veronica leaned forward. She smelled of vanilla and ambition. She looked at the papers as if they were a menu and she was about to order the lobster. It is the least you could do, Harrison, she said. After the years I gave you, the best years of my life. I didn't look at her. If I looked at her, I might lose my nerve. I might remember the way she looked at Leo that morning, and I might reach across the table and strangle her. So I looked at the water pitcher in the center of the table instead. However, Richard continued leaning back in his chair and tenting his fingers. My client feels that there are a few outstanding issues. Given the disparity in future earning potential and the lifestyle to which Mrs. Clark has become accustomed, we feel that a simple asset transfer is not quite enough to ensure her security. Sarah stiffened beside me. I could feel the heat radiating off her. Richard, Sarah said, her voice tight. We have given you everything. The real estate alone is worth $25 million. The cars are another $5 million. You are asking for blood from a stone. Richard smiled that oily smile again. We are asking for fairness, Sarah. Harrison is a legend. He can make more money. Veronica cannot. Therefore, we are adding 2 stipulations to the final agreement. First, we require Harrison to cover all legal fees for both parties. Sarah opened her mouth to object, but Richard raised a hand. And second, he said, dropping the hammer. We want a lump sum spousal support buyout. $2 million. Cash. Wired to Veronica's personal account within 24 hours of signing. Sarah slammed her hand on the table. Absolutely not, she shouted. That is extortion, Richard. We are walking. Harrison, get up. We are going to court. I didn't move. I watched Veronica. Her eyes had widened at the mention of the $2 million. It was a number she understood. It was tangible. It was shopping sprees in Paris. It was freedom. She was practically vibrating with greed. $2 million, I said softly. Yes, Richard said, confident now. $2 million. Or we don't sign today. We drag this out. We depose you. We audit your books going back 30 years. We make your life a living hell, Harrison. I looked at Sarah. She was red in the face, ready to fight to the death for me. She was a good lawyer, a good friend, but she didn't know the endgame. Sit down, Sarah, I said. Harrison, don't you dare, she warned. I turned to Richard. I will pay the legal fees, I said, and I will pay the $2 million. Veronica let out a little squeal of delight. She grabbed Richard's arm, squeezing it. Excellent, Richard said, pulling a pen from his pocket. Then we have a deal. Not yet, I said. Richard paused the pen hovering over the paper. I have one condition, I said. Richard sighed. I told you, Harrison, we are not negotiating the house or the... It has nothing to do with the money, I interrupted. It has to do with the boy. Veronica's face darkened. What about him? I reached into my briefcase. I pulled out the single document I had drafted myself the night before. It was simple, brutal, and final. I placed it on the table and slid it toward her. This is a waiver of parental rights, I explained. It states that you voluntarily and irrevocably terminate all legal and physical custody of Leo Clark. It states that you waive any right to make medical or educational decisions for him. And most importantly, it states that you waive any future claim to his estate, his trust funds, or any assets held in his name now or in the future. You walk away, Veronica, completely. You never call him. You never visit him. You are not his mother anymore. You are a stranger. The room went silent. Even Richard looked uncomfortable. To sell a child was a taboo that even lawyers usually tried to dress up in nicer language. You want me to sign away my son? Veronica asked slowly. I want you to be honest, I corrected. You told him he was a burden. You told him you were done. I am just putting it in writing. You sign this and you get the $2 million. You don't sign it and the deal is off. We go to court. And in court, Veronica, I will spend every dime I have to make sure you get nothing. I will burn the money before I let you have it. She looked at the document. Then she looked at Richard. Is it legal? She asked. Richard shrugged. It is unusual. But if you sign it voluntarily, yes, it is binding. But Veronica, think about the optics. If this gets out... I don't care about optics, she snapped. I care about my future. She looked at me. Her eyes were cold, dead things. He hates me anyway, she said, justifying it to herself. He is always moping. He reminds me of how old I am getting. It is better for him this way. He needs a father. She reached for the pen. She didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble. She didn't ask to read the fine print. She didn't ask if she could say goodbye. She just saw the $2 million waiting on the other side of that signature. She pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. The scratching sound was loud in the quiet room. Veronica Clark. She signed it with a flourish. There, she said, pushing the paper back to me. He is your problem now. Where is my check? I took the waiver. I checked the signature. It was valid. I folded it carefully and put it in my breast pocket right next to my heart. It was the most valuable thing in the room. Sarah. I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Give her the check. Sarah pulled the cashier's check from her folder. She looked at Veronica with pure, unadulterated disgust. She slid the check across the glass table. Veronica snatched it up. She stared at the zeros. $2 million, plus the house, plus the apartment. She was rich. She was free. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Well, Harrison, she said, flashing a bright, winning smile. I suppose this is goodbye. No hard feelings, right? It was just business. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had just sold her child for the price of a condo. Yes, Veronica, I said. Just business. Richard stood up, shaking my hand. A pleasure doing business with you, Harrison. You are a gentleman. I stood up. I felt heavy and light at the same time. Enjoy the house, Veronica, I said. It is a beautiful structure. I will, she said, already texting someone on her phone, probably the tennis instructor. I am going to throw a huge party this weekend. A housewarming. You are not invited, of course. Of course, I said. I turned and walked out of the conference room. Sarah followed me, her heels clicking rapidly on the floor. We got into the elevator. The doors closed, shutting out the sight of Veronica's victory lap. Sarah looked at me. She was shaking. That was the most horrific thing I have ever seen, she whispered. She didn't even blink, Harrison. She sold Leo. I nodded, watching the floor numbers drop. She did, I said. And in doing so, she just sealed her own fate. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I touched the pocket where the waiver sat. She thinks she stripped me of my assets, Sarah. She thinks she took the house and the land and the future. But she forgot one thing. The elevator chimed as we reached the lobby. What? Sarah asked. I stepped out into the lobby. She forgot to ask who owns the ground. I said. I walked out into the street. The sun was setting, painting the city in shades of blood and gold. It was done. She had the house. I had the boy. And in 24 hours, the clock on the Phoenix Trust would strike midnight. I took out my phone and sent a single text message to my trustee, Arthur. It is signed. Execute the eviction notice at 12:01 a.m. I put the phone away. I needed to go home. I needed to go to the small rental apartment I had secured that morning. I needed to tell Leo that he was safe, that he was never going to be rejected again. Veronica Clark was planning a party. I was planning a funeral for her lifestyle, and the guest of honor was going to be reality. The day we left the Malibu house felt less like a move and more like a deportation. The California sun was beating down on the white stucco walls, but inside the air was frigid. Veronica stood in the center of the grand foyer, holding a clipboard like a prison warden conducting a final cell inspection. She was wearing a silk caftan and sipping sparkling water, watching with hawk-like intensity as Leo and I carried our lives out in cardboard boxes. She wasn't helping. She was auditing. Every time I reached for something that wasn't strictly clothing or personal toiletries, she would clear her throat and point a manicured finger at the list in her hand. Not that painting, Harrison, she said, as I reached for a small seascape that I had bought in a street market in Lisbon 30 years ago. That is listed on the inventory under wall art. It stays. It cost $50, Veronica. I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. It has no value. It has aesthetic value, she corrected, marking something on her clipboard. It ties the room together. Leave it. I put the painting down. I didn't fight. I couldn't fight. Every minute I spent in that house was a minute that shaved a year off my life. I just wanted to be gone. I wanted to take my son and vanish before I lost my composure and did something that would ruin the plan. I walked to Leo's room. He was packing his books, his hands moving with a slow, heavy sadness that broke my heart. His room, which used to be his sanctuary, was now just a collection of assets owned by his mother. She had already tagged his gaming computer and his television with little blue stickers that meant, "Do not remove." "Just the clothes, Leo," I said gently, "and the books. Leave the rest. We will buy new things, better things." He looked at me, his eyes red. "It isn't about the things, Dad. It's that she wants them more than she wants me. She wants my TV, but she doesn't want me to watch it." I pulled him into a hug. "I know, son. I know. But we are leaving, and that is the most important thing. We are escaping." We carried his boxes out to the driveway. My 1998 Ford F-150 was parked there, the only vehicle Veronica hadn't claimed in the divorce, because she said it looked like something a gardener would drive. It was rusted, the suspension was shot, and the air conditioning hadn't worked in a decade, but it was mine. It was the only thing on this property that was truly mine anymore. We were loading the last of the boxes into the truck bed when I heard a commotion from the living room. I dropped the tailgate and ran back inside. Leo was standing by the grand piano in the corner of the living room. It was a Steinway vintage 1920s with chipped keys and a scar on the lid where I had dropped a candlestick years ago. It wasn't the most expensive item in the house, but it was the soul of the room. My father had taught me to play on that piano. I had taught Leo to play on that piano. It was the only thing that had ever brought us peace in this house. Leo had his arms wrapped around the bench, trying to drag it toward the door. He was straining his face, flushed with effort and desperation. Veronica was standing in front of him, blocking his path. She wasn't shouting. She was smiling, that tight, condescending smile that made me want to scream. "Put it down, Leo," she said, taking a sip of her water. "You are scratching the floor." "It is mine," Leo shouted, his voice cracking. "Grandpa gave it to Dad. Dad gave it to me. You don't even play. You hate music." "It doesn't matter if I play," Veronica said coolly. "It is listed as a furnishing in the primary residence. The settlement agreement your father signed yesterday transfers all furnishings to me. It stays." Leo looked at me as I entered the room. "Dad, tell her. Tell her it's ours. We can't leave it. It's Grandpa's." I looked at the piano. I looked at the woman standing in front of it. She didn't want the piano. She probably couldn't even tell the difference between a middle C and a door hinge. She wanted it because Leo loved it. She wanted it because taking it hurt him, and hurting him was her way of proving she had won. It was a power move, pure and simple. I walked over to Leo. I put my hands on his shoulders. I could feel him trembling. "Leo," I said softly, "let it go." "But Dad," he pleaded, tears spilling onto his cheeks. "It is just wood and wire, son," I said, staring hard at Veronica. "It is just a thing. We carry the music in our heads. She can keep the box. She can keep the silence." Veronica laughed. "That is very poetic, Harrison. But yes, I will keep the box. It looks good in this corner. Now please get this junk out of my house. I have decorators coming at 2. I steered Leo away from the piano. He resisted for a moment, his fingers trailing over the ivory keys one last time, and then he slumped against me, defeated. We walked out of the living room, leaving the ghost of my father and the music of our past behind. We walked out the front door into the blinding heat. We climbed into the old truck. The cab smelled of stale coffee and gasoline, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented air of the mansion. I started the engine. It coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a defiant growl. Veronica stood in the doorway, framed by the massive oak columns. She looked like a queen surveying her conquered lands. She waved a tiny mocking flutter of her fingers. "Goodbye, boys," she called out. "Don't be strangers. Actually do. It is better for everyone." I put the truck in gear. I didn't wave back. I didn't flip her off, though the urge was strong. I just looked at her one last time. I looked at the house she was so proud of. I looked at the land she was standing on. Leo was crying silently in the passenger seat, looking out the side mirror as his childhood home receded into the distance. I reached over and squeezed his knee. "Don't look back." "Leo," I said, "we are not going that way." The heavy iron gates of the estate swung shut behind us with a final metallic clang. We were out. We were homeless in a sense. We were stripped of our status, our luxury, our comfort. To the world we were losers driving a rust bucket away from a palace. But as I turned onto the Pacific Coast Highway, merging into the traffic of ordinary people living ordinary lives, I felt a strange vibration in my chest. It wasn't panic. It was anticipation. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 11 a.m. 13 hours. 13 hours until midnight. 13 hours until the calendar turned. 13 hours until the 25-year ground lease on the land beneath Veronica's feet expired. She was standing there in her silk caftan, drinking her sparkling water, planning her parties, surrounded by her stolen treasures. She thought she was the queen of the castle. She didn't know she was a squatter on borrowed time. I muttered under my breath, low enough that Leo couldn't hear me over the rumble of the engine. Enjoy it, Veronica. Enjoy the view. Enjoy the marble. Enjoy the silence. Because tomorrow, the ground is going to open up and swallow you whole, and I hope you are wearing comfortable shoes when it happens. I pressed the accelerator. The truck groaned but moved forward, carrying us away from the past and toward a future that was going to be very, very interesting. We had left paradise, yes, but we had packed the detonator in our pocket. The apartment complex was called The Palms, but there wasn't a single palm tree in sight, just a vast expanse of cracked asphalt and a few dying bushes that smelled of cat urine. It was located 20 miles inland in a neighborhood where the houses had bars on the windows and the convenience stores kept the cashier behind bulletproof glass. We pulled into the parking lot, and the engine of the truck finally died with a shuddering rattle that sounded like a death rattle. I looked up at the building. It was a beige stucco box stained with decades of smog and neglect. Unit 2B was ours. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and 600 square feet of living space. It cost $1,200 a month, which was less than what Veronica spent on bottled water in a week. Home sweet home, Leo, I said, trying to inject a note of optimism into my voice that I didn't feel. Leo didn't answer. He grabbed his duffel bag and slammed the truck door so hard the side mirror wobbled. He walked toward the stairwell, his head down, his headphones on, trying to block out the sound of a couple arguing loudly on a balcony above us. We carried the boxes up the stairs. The elevator was out of order, a piece of paper taped to the doors, with the words broken scribbled in black marker. My knees popped and ground with every step. At 70 years old, carrying 40-pound boxes up 2 flights of concrete stairs is not exercise, it is torture. But I did it. I carried box after box, sweating through my shirt, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. When we finally got everything inside, the apartment was stiflingly hot. The air conditioning unit in the window was ancient and covered in a layer of grime that suggested it hadn't been turned on since the Reagan administration. I flipped the switch and it coughed out a cloud of dust and a noise like a jet engine. But the air that came out was barely lukewarm. Leo dropped his bag in the center of the living room. The carpet was a shade of brown that was designed to hide stains, but failed to hide the cigarette burns near the door. The walls were thin. We could hear the bass of a stereo thumping from the unit next door, and the sound of a baby crying from the unit below. Leo looked around. He looked at the peeling paint on the ceiling. He looked at the kitchen, which was a galley so narrow you couldn't open the oven and the fridge at the same time. He looked at the single window which looked out onto a brick wall and a dumpster. "This is it," he asked, his voice flat and dead. "This is where we live now." "It is temporary, son," I said, wiping the sweat from my forehead with a handkerchief. "Just until we get settled. Just until the dust settles." He turned to look at me, and for the first time since we left Malibu, the sadness in his eyes was replaced by a white-hot anger. "Temporary," he repeated. "Dad, look at this place. It is a dump. It smells like mold and old soup. We had a mansion this morning. We had a beach, and now we are here. Why?" I walked to the kitchen sink to get a glass of water. I turned the handle. The faucet groaned and a stream of brown water sputtered out, followed by a steady, rhythmic drip that echoed in the small space. Drip, drip, drip. "I told you, Leo," I said, watching the water run until it turned clear. "I made a deal. I had to give her the assets to get full custody. It was the price of freedom." Leo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that didn't belong in the throat of a 16-year-old boy. The price of freedom, he mocked. No, Dad. It was the price of you being a coward. I stiffened. I turned off the tap and faced him. I am not a coward, Leo. Yes, you are, he shouted, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You are Harrison Clark. You built half the city. You are a billionaire. Or you were. You let her walk all over you. You let her take everything. You let her take my piano. You let her kick us out like we were garbage. And you didn't even fight. You just signed the papers and thanked her for the privilege. He was shaking now, tears streaming down his face again, but this time they were tears of rage. Why do we have to live like this? He screamed, gesturing at the moldy walls. You have money, Dad. I know you have money. Why are we playing poor? Why are we punishing ourselves? Is it some kind of lesson? Are you trying to teach me character? Because I don't want character, Dad. I want my home. I want my life back. I couldn't tell him. I physically couldn't tell him. If I told him now, if I told him that I still had millions stashed in offshore accounts and blind trusts, if I told him that this apartment was just a stage set for the final act of my revenge, he might slip. He might tell a friend. He might text Veronica in a moment of anger. And if she knew she had been played before the clock struck midnight, she could file an injunction. She could claim fraud. She could stop the eviction. So I had to swallow his anger. I had to let him think I was weak. I had to let him hate me. It is complicated, Leo, I said softly. Liquid assets are tight right now. The divorce froze a lot of things. We have to be careful. We have to be frugal. Frugal, he spat the word out like poison. This isn't frugal. This is pathetic. She won, Dad. Don't you see that? She is in our house drinking her wine, laughing at us, and we are here listening to the neighbors fight. She won, and you let her win because you were too scared to stand up to her. He picked up a cardboard box, his box of books, and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a heavy thud and split open, spilling novels across the dirty carpet. I hate you, he whispered, his voice breaking. I hate her for leaving, but I hate you for letting it happen. You are supposed to be the strong one. You are supposed to be the protector. But you are just a weak old man. He turned and stormed down the short hallway to the second bedroom. He slammed the door so hard the pictures I hadn't even hung yet rattled in their boxes. I stood alone in the center of the living room. The silence that followed his outburst was worse than the shouting. I could hear his muffled sobs through the thin drywall. Every sob was a knife in my chest. To be called a coward by your own son, to see the disappointment in his eyes. It was a price higher than any check I had ever written. I walked to the window and looked out at the alley. A stray cat was picking through the garbage in the dumpster. I felt a kinship with it, scavenging for survival in a world that didn't care. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since the toast I didn't finish that morning. I walked to the small refrigerator we had brought with us. It was empty, except for a pack of bologna, a loaf of white bread, and a jar of mustard I had bought at a gas station on the way here. I took out 2 slices of bread. They were dry. I peeled the red plastic casing off a slice of bologna. I spread the yellow mustard with a plastic knife because we hadn't unpacked the silverware yet. I stood at the counter and ate the sandwich. It tasted of salt and preservatives and poverty. Drip, drip, drip. The kitchen faucet was still leaking. It was a small thing, a washer that had worn out, a seal that had broken. But in the silence of the apartment, it sounded like a drumbeat. It was the sound of neglect. It was the sound of a life falling apart. I put the half-eaten sandwich down. I couldn't swallow it. I walked over to the toolbox I had brought in from the truck. It was an old red metal box, heavy and scratched, the same one I had used when I started my construction business 45 years ago. I opened it, and the smell of oil and metal wafted up a scent that reminded me of who I used to be. Before the suits, before the boardrooms, before the billions. I was a man who built things. I was a man who fixed things. I took out a wrench and a screwdriver. I walked to the sink. I didn't call a plumber. I didn't call a superintendent. I knelt down on the linoleum floor, my old knees protesting against the hard surface. I crawled under the cabinet into the dark, tight space beneath the sink. I turned off the water valve. I disassembled the faucet. I found the worn-out washer. It was brittle and cracked just like my marriage. I replaced it with a spare I kept in the box. I tightened the nuts. I checked the seals. My hands were covered in grease. My back ached. I was 70 years old, and I was lying on the floor of a cheap apartment, fixing a plumbing fixture that wasn't even mine. But as I worked, the noise in my head quieted. The pain in my chest eased just a fraction. This was a problem I could solve. This was something broken that I could make whole again. I crawled out from under the sink and turned the water back on. The stream was steady. I turned the handle off. Silence. No drip. No leak. It held. I washed my hands in the sink, scrubbing the grease from my knuckles with dish soap. I looked at my reflection in the dark window glass. I looked tired. I looked old. I looked exactly like the beaten man Veronica thought I was. But as I dried my hands on a paper towel, I glanced at my watch. 6 p.m., 6 hours left. Leo was crying in his room, thinking his life was over. Veronica was likely drinking champagne in Malibu, thinking her life had just begun. And I was here eating bologna and fixing pipes. Let them think I am broken, I thought. Let them think I am weak. Let Leo hate me for a night. It will make the redemption that much sweeter. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving myself in the darkness. I sat down on one of the unopened boxes and waited. I was good at waiting. I had waited 20 years for the market to turn. I had waited 10 years to buy the right parcel of land. I could wait 6 hours for the axe to fall. The ground beneath Veronica's feet was already trembling. She just couldn't feel it yet. But soon, very soon, she would feel nothing else. 2 weeks of living in the apartment had turned my hands rough and my patience thin. The faucet was fixed, but the walls still smelled of despair, and every morning I woke up to the sound of Leo trying to be quiet in the kitchen, making instant oatmeal with water because we were rationing the milk. It was a performance, a necessary theater of poverty, but that didn't make the reality of it any less grinding. I needed to maintain the illusion of total defeat just a little longer. I decided it was time to make an appearance in my old world. I put on my best suit. It was a charcoal gray Italian cut that used to fit me like armor, but now hung a little loose on my frame after weeks of stress and skipped meals. I drove the rusted Ford truck to the Coastline Club. It was the kind of place where deals were made over lobster thermidor, and the valet parking cost more than my current weekly grocery budget. I was meeting George, a city zoning commissioner I had known for 30 years. He was one of the few people who returned my calls after the news of the divorce settlement hit the grapevine. The valet looked at my truck with open disdain. He hesitated before taking the keys, as if he was afraid the rust might be contagious. I handed him a $5 bill, which was all I had in my pocket, and walked inside. The air conditioning hit me like a wall of money. The smell of truffle oil and expensive perfume filled my lungs, reminding me of everything I had voluntarily walked away from. I sat at a corner table with George. He looked uncomfortable. He kept checking his watch and glancing around the room, as if being seen with me might damage his credit rating. We ordered lunch. I ordered the soup. George ordered the steak. "So Harrison," George said, cutting into his meat, "I heard about the settlement. Total capitulation. That does not sound like you." I took a sip of water. "I am tired, George. I just wanted to ensure Leo was taken care of. I wanted a clean break." George shook his head. "You gave her everything, Harrison. The rumor is you are liquidating assets just to pay the legal fees. People are saying you lost your touch, that you went soft. Let them talk, I said. Reputation is a currency, George, but peace of mind is an asset. We finished the meal in awkward silence. When the check came, I reached for my wallet. It was a reflex. For 40 years, I had always paid the check. It was a power move. It was habit. I pulled out my black Centurion card, the heavy titanium rectangle that used to open any door in the world. I handed it to the waiter. He took it with a smile and walked away. 2 minutes later, he returned. The smile was gone. He leaned down and whispered in a voice that was meant to be discreet, but sounded like a shout in the quiet restaurant. I am sorry, Mr. Clark. The card was declined. I felt the blood rush to my face. Of course it was declined. The accounts were linked to the assets I had transferred. Veronica had likely frozen or canceled the secondary cards the moment the ink was dry. I had forgotten. For a second, I had forgotten the game I was playing. I have another card, I mumbled, patting my pockets, knowing full well I didn't. I left my wallet in the "Do not bother, Harrison." The voice came from behind me. It was sharp and amused and familiar. I froze. The restaurant seemed to go silent. I turned around. Veronica was standing there. She looked radiant. She was wearing a new Chanel dress that I knew cost $6,000. Her hair was lighter, her skin glowing with expensive treatments. She looked like a woman who had just won the lottery, which essentially she had. Standing next to her was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a gym. He was maybe 25 years old, with bleached blonde hair and a tennis shirt that was unbuttoned, one too many buttons. He was holding Veronica's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles possessively. This was the tennis instructor, the man she was spending my fortune on. Veronica looked at the waiter and then at me. Her eyes were dancing with malice. "Put it on my tab," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "My husband, ex-husband, is having a bit of a liquidity crisis." The waiter looked uncomfortable. "Yes, Mrs. Clark. Thank you." She turned her gaze back to me. She looked me up and down, taking in the loose suit, the tired eyes, the gray stubble on my chin. She stepped closer, bringing a cloud of familiar perfume with her. "You look terrible, Harrison," she said loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. "I heard you are living in some squalid apartment complex inland." "Is that true?" I stood up. I wanted to maintain my dignity. "I am fine, Veronica," I said. "Thank you for lunch. I will pay you back." She laughed, and the tennis player laughed with her, a hollow, sycophantic sound. "Don't be silly," she said, reaching out and patting my cheek. "Consider it charity, a donation to the poor. Honestly, Harrison, it is pathetic. You used to be a titan. Now look at you. You can't even buy a bowl of soup." The restaurant was deadly quiet now. Everyone was watching. My old business partners, my social acquaintances, the people who used to beg for my time. They were all watching the old lion being kicked by the hyena. I looked at her hand on my face. I looked at the boy toy she had bought with my money. I looked at the smug satisfaction in her eyes. She thought this was the victory lap. She thought this was the moment she crushed me completely. I stepped back, breaking her touch. "You are very generous, Veronica," I said, my voice steady. "Enjoy your lunch." I turned to George. "I am sorry about this, George." George didn't look at me. He was looking at his steak, suddenly finding it very interesting. "No problem, Harrison," he mumbled. "Good luck." I walked out of the dining room. I could feel their eyes on my back. I could hear the whispers starting, the laughter rippling through the room. I walked past the host stand, past the bar where people turned to stare. I walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the valet stand. The valet brought my rusted truck around. It sputtered and backfired, a loud gunshot sound that made a woman waiting for her Mercedes jump. I climbed inside. The seat was hot. The air was stale. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The humiliation burned in my chest like acid. To be pitied, to be laughed at, to have my wife pay for my meal with my own money while her lover watched. It was a level of degradation I had never experienced. But then I took a breath. I let the anger settle. I let it crystallize into something cold and hard. She had just confirmed everything. She was arrogant. She was careless. She was so busy enjoying her power that she wasn't watching her feet. She was spending money she didn't technically have on credit lines, secured by assets she didn't fully control. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a burner phone. It was a cheap, prepaid device, untraceable and secure. I powered it on. I dialed a number I had memorized weeks ago. It rang once. Yes, a voice answered. It was Arthur, the trustee. I looked back at the restaurant entrance. I could see Veronica and her tennis player walking in laughing like royalty. It is time I said, my voice devoid of the shame I had just shown the world. Are you sure, Mr. Clark? Arthur asked. Once we initiate this, there is no going back. The notices will be filed with the county clerk immediately. The liens will be activated. The freeze on the ground assets will be absolute. I watched the valet parking a Ferrari. She just paid for my lunch, Arthur, I said. She called it charity. I understood, Arthur said. Initiating Phase 2. The eviction notices for the Malibu property and the New York penthouse will be served within the hour. The tax lien transfer notices for the land usage will follow by courier. Good, I said. And Arthur? Yes, sir. Make sure the process server knocks loudly. I want her to hear it over the sound of her own voice. I hung up the phone and snapped it shut. I threw it onto the passenger seat. I put the truck in gear and pulled out into traffic. The humiliation was gone. The shame was gone. All that was left was the cold, mechanical ticking of a clock that had just run out of time. Veronica thought I was pathetic. She thought I was finished. She didn't know that I was just the distraction. The real show was about to start, and the admission price was going to cost her everything she had. Back in the suffocating quiet of the apartment, I did not sleep. The humiliation at the restaurant had settled into a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was not fear, it was fuel. I waited until Leo's breathing in the next room evened out into the heavy rhythm of teenage sleep before I knelt down beside the stack of boxes in the corner. Veronica had supervised the packing with the eye of a vulture looking for carry-on, but she had only been looking for things that glittered. She wanted the silver, the crystal, the first editions. She had completely ignored the battered gray metal lockbox that I had kept under my desk for 20 years. To her, it looked like a container for tax receipts or old warranty manuals. To me, it was the nuclear football. I pulled the box onto the linoleum floor. It was heavy, dense with the weight of paper and secrets. I dialed the combination on the rusty tumbler. 3, 2, 9. It clicked open with a sound that felt loud in the small room. Inside there were no diamonds, no stacks of cash, just files. Manila folders worn soft at the edges, smelling of dust and time. I flipped past the birth certificates and the insurance policies until I found the one at the very back. It was labeled in my own handwriting from a quarter of a century ago. Project Phoenix, 1998. I opened the file and spread the documents out on the cheap laminate floor. Under the harsh light of the kitchen bulb, they looked innocuous, just pages of dense legal jargon and architectural surveys. But as I traced the lines on the site maps, I felt a surge of the old power returning. I was not just a 70-year-old man eating bologna sandwiches. I was Harrison Clark, the man who had reshaped the zoning laws of this city. 25 years ago, after my first marriage dissolved and took half my net worth with it, I made a vow. I swore that no one would ever take my foundation again. I realized then that ownership was an illusion if you didn't control the ground. So I had engaged in a complex and aggressive restructuring of my entire portfolio. I created a bifurcated ownership model. It was a strategy usually reserved for commercial skyscrapers or mobile home parks, not luxury residential estates. I picked up the trust deed. It was a beautiful piece of legal engineering. In 1998, I had transferred the physical land, the dirt, the sand, the bedrock of the Malibu estate, and the footprint of the New York building into an irrevocable trust. The trust was named Leo's Future Trust. I had appointed a corporate trustee to manage it effectively, removing the land from my personal assets. Then I had my personal holding company, which owned the physical houses, the wood, the glass, the marble sign, a 99-year ground lease with the trust. But there was a clause, a poison pill clause buried on page 47, section C, paragraph 4. It stated that in the event of a transfer of ownership of the physical structure to any party other than a blood descendant, the ground lease would automatically terminate not in 99 years, but at midnight, on the date of transfer unless renegotiated at current market rates. Veronica had the house. She had the deed to the structure. But she didn't own the sand it stood on. She was essentially a tenant who had just bought a very expensive tent on someone else's campground, and she hadn't paid the rent in 25 years. I looked at the date on the settlement agreement I had signed. Yesterday. The clock started ticking the moment the judge stamped those papers. "Dad, what are you doing?" I looked up. Leo was standing in the doorway rubbing sleep from his eyes. He looked at the papers spread out on the floor, like a war map. "Just working, son," I said, gathering the papers quickly. "Just checking some old records." He walked over and picked up one of the site maps. It showed the Malibu property line. "Is that the house?" he asked, his voice tight. "It is," I said. "Why do you have it?" Leo asked, dropping the paper as if it burned him. "It is hers now. We don't live there. We are never going back." "Why torture yourself, Dad?" I looked at him. I looked at the confusion and the hurt in his face. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to scream it. But I couldn't. Not yet. The element of surprise was the only leverage we had. "I am not torturing myself, Leo," I said, standing up and placing the file back in the box. "I am just making sure the paperwork is in order. Sometimes, son, the things people throw away are the most valuable things of all. Go back to bed. Tomorrow is going to be a very busy day." He looked at me skeptically, but he was too tired to argue. He shuffled back to his room. I waited until his door clicked shut, then I grabbed my jacket and the metal box. I needed to make a delivery. I drove the truck through the sleeping city. The streets were empty, the streetlights reflecting off the hood. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner near the airport. It was the kind of place where truck drivers and shift workers ate pie at 3 in the morning. In the back booth, a man was waiting for me. He was older than me, with skin like parchment paper and a suit that looked like it was from another era. He was drinking tea and reading a newspaper with a magnifying glass. This was Arthur. He had been my personal banker and trustee for 40 years. He knew where every body was buried because he had dug most of the holes. I slid into the booth opposite him. I didn't say hello, I just placed the metal box on the table between us. Arthur looked at the box, then at me. His eyes were clear and sharp behind his thick glasses. "You look like hell, Harrison," he said, his voice raspy. "I feel like hell, Arthur," I replied. "But I am waking up." Arthur nodded. He tapped the box. "Is this it?" "This is it," I said. "The Phoenix file." Arthur opened the box and took out the trust documents. He didn't need to read them. He had drafted them with me. He ran his hand over the paper like he was greeting an old friend. "I received the electronic notification of the title transfer from your lawyer this afternoon," Arthur said. "The deed to the Malibu residence and the New York unit has been recorded in the name of Veronica Clark." I nodded, signaling the waitress for coffee. "It is done then." It is done, Arthur confirmed. According to the bylaws of the trust, the transfer of the improvement triggered the termination clause of the ground lease. The lease expired technically at the moment of recording. However, we have a 24-hour grace period for notification. I checked my watch. It was 3 a.m. That gives us 21 hours, I said. Arthur pulled a folder from his briefcase. He opened it, revealing a stack of legal notices printed on heavy bond paper. They were eviction notices and demands for back rent and tax indemnification. I have taken the liberty of calculating the current market value of the ground rent, Arthur said, pushing a spreadsheet toward me. Malibu beachfront property has appreciated significantly since '98. Based on the square footage and the exclusivity of the location, the fair market rent for the land alone is $60,000 a month. I looked at the number. 60,000. It was staggering. And the taxes, I asked. Arthur smiled a dry, thin smile. Under the triple net terms of the original lease, the tenant is responsible for all property taxes on the land. Since you were both the tenant and the landlord effectively, you paid them. But now the tenant is Veronica. And since the lease has been terminated due to breach of transfer terms, the trust is entitled to claw back the last 10 years of property taxes as a penalty for the lease violation. I looked at the total at the bottom of the page. $500,000 in back taxes immediately due, plus the first month's rent, plus a security deposit. She will owe the trust nearly $750,000 by midnight tomorrow, I said. And if she cannot pay, Arthur said, closing the folder, the trust has the right to seize the improvements. The house, the furniture, everything on the land to satisfy the debt. She doesn't have the money, I said. I gave her $2 million, but she has likely already spent half of it on paying off her own debts and putting deposits down on her new life. She won't have the liquidity. Then she will be evicted, Arthur said simply. It is a mathematical certainty. I took a sip of the black coffee. It was bitter and hot. Serve her, Arthur, I said. Serve her at 1 minute past midnight. I want her to be sleeping in that bed, thinking she owns the world when the doorbell rings. Arthur nodded. We have a process server on retainer. He is very discreet and very persistent. He will deliver the package to the Malibu address and the New York address simultaneously. I reached across the table and shook Arthur's hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. Thank you, Arthur, for keeping this safe, for all these years. Arthur looked at me, his expression softening slightly. You built a fortress, Harrison, he said. You just forgot to live in it. Now you are using the bricks to bury your enemies. It is a valid strategy. I stood up, taking the metal box back. It is not about burying her, Arthur, I said. It is about digging my son out. I walked out of the diner, leaving Arthur to his tea and his calculations. The sky was beginning to turn gray in the east. A new day was coming. The day Veronica Clark would find out that gravity is a very harsh mistress. I drove back to the apartment, feeling the vibration of the engine in my bones. I wasn't tired anymore. I was electrified. I had given her the rope. I had watched her tie the knot. Now all I had to do was kick the chair away. When I got back to the apartment, Leo was awake, sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. Where did you go? He asked, not looking at me. I went to work, Leo, I said, walking into the kitchen to make him breakfast. I went to get our life back. He didn't ask what I meant. He just shook his head and turned away. He didn't believe me. Not yet. But he would. By tomorrow morning, he would understand everything. I sat down at the small dining table and watched the sun come up over the parking lot. The light hit the peeling paint and the cracked asphalt, making everything look stark and ugly. But for the first time since this nightmare began, the ugliness didn't bother me, because I knew it was temporary. The clock was ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Every second brought Veronica closer to the edge of the cliff she didn't even know she was standing on. And I was going to enjoy the fall. The lights of the Malibu mansion were blazing so brightly, they probably served as a beacon for ships at sea. From where I sat in my darkened truck parked a quarter-mile down the coast highway, I could see the glow radiating into the night sky. It was the color of burning money. Veronica was not known for subtlety. She was throwing a housewarming party to end all housewarming parties, a coronation ceremony for the Queen of the Coast. Inside, I knew exactly what was happening. I could picture it with the clarity of a man who had watched her operate for a decade. The champagne would be vintage Dom Perignon, flowing like water into crystal flutes. The music would be loud, a thumping bass line shaking the floors I had laid myself. She would be wearing something white, something bridal, something that screamed innocence while she stood in the center of the wreckage she had caused. She was surrounded by her court. The tennis instructor was there, of course, probably wearing a linen suit she had bought him yesterday. Her friends from the club, the women who had whispered about me behind my back, were there drinking my wine and laughing at my expense. They were toasting her victory. They were celebrating the liberation of Veronica Clark from the tyranny of her boring old husband. I checked my watch. It was 11:55. 5 minutes. I imagined Veronica raising her glass. I could almost hear her voice, shrill and triumphant, cutting through the noise. To me, she would be saying, "To the Queen of the Castle, to getting what we deserve." She had no idea how right she was. She was about to get exactly what she deserved. At the service entrance of the estate, a nondescript gray sedan pulled up. It wasn't a guest. It wasn't a caterer. It was a man named Mr. Henderson, not my accountant, but a process server Arthur had hired. A man who specialized in delivering bad news to people who didn't want to hear it. He checked his watch. He waited. He was a professional. He wouldn't knock a second before midnight. The law is precise, and so was he. Inside the house, the party was reaching its peak. Veronica was likely giving a tour, showing off the master bedroom, showing off the ocean view from the balcony, boasting about how she had negotiated the settlement. She would be pointing out the art on the walls, claiming she had curated it. She would be touching the marble countertops, claiming ownership over every square inch of stone and glass. Midnight struck. The 12th chime of the grandfather clock in the hall would have been drowned out by the music, but the doorbell was loud. It was a deep, resonant gong that echoed through the house. Veronica probably frowned. Who could be arriving at midnight? Perhaps a surprise guest. Perhaps a celebrity. She loved surprises when they were wrapped in gold paper. She walked to the door, her heels clicking on the foyer tiles. She opened it, expecting a gift. She found a man in a cheap suit holding a thick envelope. "Delivery for Veronica Clark," the man said, his voice flat and bored. Veronica laughed, a bubbly champagne-fueled giggle. "Oh, is it a singing telegram? Did Harrison send a final pathetic plea? Or is it from you girls?" She looked back at her friends who were crowding the hallway, curious about the late-night visitor. "Sign here, please," the man said, holding out a clipboard. She signed with a flourish. "Veronica Clark. The signature of the lady of the manor. The signature of the owner." She took the envelope. It was heavy, thick, official. The man didn't say congratulations. He didn't say enjoy the party. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Veronica closed the door. She stood under the $10,000 chandelier, holding the grenade I had pulled the pin on 24 hours ago. "Open it," someone shouted. "Let's see what it is." She tore open the envelope. She pulled out the stack of papers. The top page was not a greeting card. It was not a check. It was a legal notice printed on heavy bond paper with the letterhead of the Leo Clark Future Trust. She squinted, trying to focus her eyes. The alcohol was making the words swim, but the header was bold and impossible to miss. "Notice of termination of ground lease and demand for immediate removal of improvements." She read it again. Termination. Removal. Improvements. The words didn't make sense together. She owned the house. She had the deed. I had signed it over. She flipped the page. Notice of delinquent ground rent and tax indemnification. Amount due immediately. $742,000. She started to laugh. It was a loud, incredulous laugh that made her guests smile uncertainly. "What is it?" Veronica, her tennis player, asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Who is it from?" "It is a joke," she screeched, waving the papers in the air. "It is a prank. Harrison is trying to be funny. Listen to this, everyone." She cleared her throat, striking a dramatic pose. "It says, I have to remove the improvements from the land." Remove the improvements. That means the house. He wants me to move the house. Can you believe it? He says the ground lease has expired. The guests laughed. It sounded absurd. Move a $15 million mansion. It was obviously a bitter old man's joke. "He thinks he can scare me," she shouted, her voice rising with hysteria. "He thinks he can ruin my night with fake legal papers. I own this house, Harrison. I have the deed. I have the keys. You gave it to me." She looked at the papers again, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. "Pursuant to the terms of the 1998 trust agreement, ownership of the physical structure does not convey ownership of the underlying real property. Eviction proceedings will commence in 48 hours. She stopped laughing. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, just a shadow, but she pushed it away. She was the winner. Winners don't get evicted. "This is garbage," she announced. "Absolute garbage. He is just jealous. He is sitting in some sad little apartment wishing he was here, and he sent this to annoy me. Well, it won't work." She grabbed the stack of papers with both hands. The thick bond paper resisted, but she was fueled by rage and adrenaline. She ripped them in half. The sound was loud, like a gunshot in the foyer. "I am the queen of this castle," she screamed, throwing the torn pieces into the air like confetti. "No one tells me to leave. No one." Her friends cheered. They clapped. They toasted her defiance. They didn't know they were cheering for a woman who had just torn up her own eviction notice. They didn't know that ignorance of the law is not a defense, especially when the law is coming for your throat. Veronica turned to her lover and kissed him hard, desperate to prove that she was in control, desperate to prove that the piece of paper meant nothing. "Turn the music up," she commanded. "Let's dance." The bass thumped again. The party resumed. Veronica danced in the center of the room, spinning and laughing, stepping on the torn scraps of paper scattered on the marble floor. She was dancing on the wreckage of her own future. From my truck, I watched the lights flicker as the music pumped. I didn't need to see inside to know what she had done. I knew her. She would tear it up. She would deny it. She would double down on her delusion. That was exactly what I wanted. By tearing up the notice, she had technically been served, but had chosen to ignore it. She wasn't calling a lawyer. She wasn't calling the bank. She was dancing. Every minute she spent dancing was a minute she wasn't preparing a defense. Every bottle of champagne she opened was another nail in the coffin. I put the truck in gear. My work here was done for the night. The seed of doubt had been planted, even if she tried to rip it out. When she woke up tomorrow with a hangover and the realization that the papers were real, the panic would set in, and by then it would be too late. I drove away from the glow of the mansion back toward the dark reality of my apartment. But the darkness didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like cover. It felt like strategy. Veronica was the queen of the castle for one more night. But the king had returned, and he had brought the chessboard with him. And she didn't even know she was already in checkmate. The courtroom was cold and smelled of floor wax and old wood, the distinct scent of a place where lives are disassembled and assets are divided. Veronica sat at the plaintiff's table looking less like a grieving divorcee and more like a avenging angel. She was wearing a black dress that cost more than my first 3 cars combined, and her face was set in a mask of righteous indignation. Beside her, Richard Sterling was arranging his papers with the confidence of a man who believes he has already won the lottery and is just waiting for the check to clear. They had sued me. It was a bold move. After tearing up the eviction notice at her party, Veronica had gone on the offensive. She filed an emergency motion for a restraining order and a civil suit for harassment, claiming that I was using fraudulent legal documents to terrorize her in her own home. She wanted the judge to hold me in contempt. She wanted damages. She wanted to strip the last shred of dignity I had left. I sat at the defendant's table with Sarah. We didn't have stacks of files. We didn't have a team of paralegals. We just had the battered metal box from my apartment sitting between us. The judge was a stern woman named Judge Patterson, who looked like she had no patience for rich people squabbling over beach houses. She peered over her glasses at Richard. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dry, "you are alleging that the defendant, Mr. Clark, has engaged in a campaign of harassment by serving your client with fake eviction notices for a property she legally owns. Is that correct?" Richard stood up, buttoning his jacket. He smiled that shark smile. "That is correct, Your Honor. Just 3 days ago, Mr. Clark signed a binding settlement agreement transferring full ownership of the Malibu estate and the New York penthouse to my client. We have the signed deeds right here." He gave her the keys. He walked away. And then, in a fit of seller's remorse, or perhaps just spite, he hired a process server to disrupt her housewarming party with these absurd documents, claiming she has no right to be there. It is emotional abuse, Your Honor. It is a desperate attempt to claw back what he legally signed away. He walked to the bench and handed the judge the settlement agreement. "Here is the transfer of title, Your Honor, signed by Harrison Clark. It grants Veronica Clark 100% ownership of the residence at 1088 Malibu Road. It is airtight." Judge Patterson scanned the document. She looked at me. "Mr. Clark," she said, "did you sign this document?" I stood up slowly. My knees popped in the quiet room. I didn't look at Veronica. I looked straight at the bench. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. I signed it. I transferred ownership of the structure to my ex-wife. I gave her the house. "Then what is this?" Richard interrupted, waving the torn eviction notice in the air. "Why are you sending her eviction notices for a house you admit you gave her?" "Because," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through his theatrics, "owning the house is not the same thing as owning the land it sits on." The room went silent. Richard frowned. He looked at the deed in his hand, then back at me. "What are you talking about?" he scoffed. "It is real estate. The land and the house are one and the same." "Not in this case," I said. I opened the metal box. I took out the yellowed file from 1998. I walked to the bench and placed it next to Richard's papers. "Your Honor, if you will look at the document labeled Trust Deed and Ground Lease, you will see that 25 years ago I severed the estate. I transferred the underlying real property, the land itself, into an irrevocable trust called the Leo Clark Future Trust. I did this to protect the asset for my heirs." Sarah stood up and handed a copy to Richard. He took it, his hands shaking slightly. He began to read, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. I continued speaking to the judge. The entity that owned the physical structure, the house, the pool, the garage, signed a 25-year ground lease with the trust. That lease, Your Honor, contained a specific clause regarding the transfer of the structure. It states that if the structure is transferred to a non-blood relative, the ground lease does not automatically transfer. It terminates. Judge Patterson flipped through the old file. She found the clause. She read it silently, her lips moving slightly. Richard looked up from the paper, his face draining of color. He looked at Veronica, who was staring at him with wide, confused eyes. "Richard," she hissed. "What is he saying?" He is saying, Richard stammered, that you own a pile of bricks, Veronica, but you don't own the ground. Objection, Richard shouted, turning back to the judge, desperate to regain control. This is archaic. This is a technicality. The settlement agreement clearly implied the transfer of the entire property. The intent was clear. The intent of the settlement agreement was to transfer the assets listed, I countered. The asset listed was the residence, the structure. The land was never listed because I didn't own the land personally. The trust owned it. I could not give her what was not mine to give. Judge Patterson looked up from the documents. She took off her glasses. She looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Mr. Sterling, she said, did you do a title search on the underlying land before you advised your client to sign the settlement? Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He hadn't. He had seen the deed to the house and assumed it included the land. It was a rookie mistake, a mistake born of arrogance. No, Your Honor, he whispered. The judge turned to me. Mr. Clark is the trust currently the legal owner of the parcel in question. Yes, Your Honor. And has the ground lease expired? It expired at midnight on the date of the transfer, Your Honor. The notice served to Ms. Clark was a formal notification of lease termination and a demand to surrender the land or enter into a new lease agreement. Judge Patterson nodded. She picked up her gavel. This court finds that the documents presented by the defendant are valid. The separation of land and improvement is a legal and binding structure common in commercial real estate, and perfectly legal in residential cases if properly documented, which this appears to be. She looked at Veronica. Ms. Clark, you are the legal owner of the house. However, you have no legal right to occupy the land beneath it. As of midnight 2 nights ago, you are technically trespassing on private property owned by the Leo Clark Future Trust. Veronica stood up her chair, scraping loudly. Trespassing, she screamed. It is my house. He gave it to me. I have the keys. You have the keys to a building, ma'am, the judge said, her voice hard. But that building is parked on someone else's lot, and that someone else has the right to ask you to move it. Move it! Veronica shrieked. It is a $15 million mansion. How am I supposed to move it? That is not the court's problem, the judge said. The owner of the land has the right to demand a clean lot, or they have the right to charge you rent for the privilege of keeping your house there. Judge Patterson banged the gavel. The sound was like a gunshot. Case dismissed. The harassment suit is baseless. The eviction notice stands. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you advise your client to negotiate with the landowner immediately before they bring in the bulldozers. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Veronica collapsed back into her chair, looking as if she had been physically struck. She looked at Richard, but he couldn't meet her eyes. He was busy stuffing papers into his briefcase, trying to figure out how he was going to explain this to his partners. I stood there feeling the cold air of the courtroom against my face. It was done. The trap had sprung. The jaws of the trust had snapped shut around her ankle, and she hadn't even seen the teeth until it was too late. Sarah leaned over to me. You did it, she whispered. She owns nothing. I looked at Veronica. She was staring at her hands, the same hands that had signed away her son for a check. She was beginning to realize that the check wasn't going to be enough. Not nearly enough. I walked over to their table. Richard stepped back as if I were radioactive. Veronica looked up at me, hatred and fear warring in her eyes. You tricked me, she spat. You old bastard. You tricked me. I didn't trick you, Veronica, I said, my voice calm. I gave you exactly what you asked for. You just didn't ask the right questions. I placed a card on the table in front of her. It was the business card for the trust administrator. Call him, I said. He has the new lease terms ready. She looked at the card. What terms? I smiled. Market rates. Veronica. Market rates. I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't need to stay for the aftermath. I knew what was coming next. The realization of the debt. The realization of the taxes. The realization that she was bankrupt. I walked out of the courtroom and into the hallway where Leo was waiting. He was sitting on a bench, his headphones around his neck, looking anxious. When he saw me, he stood up. "Dad," he asked. "What happened?" I put my arm around his shoulder. "Let's go get some pizza, son," I said. "We have a lot to talk about. And you have some papers to sign." "What papers?" he asked, falling into step beside me. "Landlord papers," I said. We walked toward the exit, leaving the wreckage of Veronica's life behind us. She had wanted the ground beneath her feet to be solid gold. Instead, she had found out it was a trapdoor, and she was still falling. The judge had left the bench, but Veronica was still frozen in her chair, a statue of disbelief carved from ice and arrogance. Her hands were clutching the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles were white bone against her tanned skin. She looked like a woman who had just stepped off a cliff and was hovering in the air for that split second before gravity remembered its job. Sarah Jenkins, my attorney, walked around the table. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of a shark, sensing blood in the water. She held a single sheet of paper in her hand. It wasn't a court document. It was an invoice. She stopped right next to Veronica. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. She leaned down, her lips inches from Veronica's ear. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the rustle of the silk of her blouse. Sarah whispered 5 words, 5 simple syllables that carried more weight than the wrecking ball that was about to hit Veronica's life. "The land belongs to Leo." Veronica flinched as if she had been burned. She turned her head slowly to look at Sarah, her eyes wide and glassy. What she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah straightened up and placed the invoice on the table directly on top of the useless deed Veronica had been clinging to. "The trust," Sarah said, her voice projecting clearly now so Richard Sterling could hear every word. "The Leo Clark Future Trust. It is an irrevocable trust established for the sole benefit of Leo Clark. Harrison is the grantor, but Leo is the beneficiary. You just signed away your son, Veronica. And in doing so, you signed away the only leverage you had to stay on that property. You are now a tenant living on your son's land, and the landlord is calling in the debt." Veronica looked down at the paper. I watched her eyes track the lines of figures. I knew what was written there. Arthur and I had drafted it with precise, brutal clarity. Item 1, Sarah recited, pointing to the first figure. "Current market ground rent for beachfront property in Malibu, zip code 90265. Adjusted for inflation and demand. $60,000 per month. Effective immediately. Payable in advance. The first payment is due by close of business today." 60,000, Veronica choked out. That is impossible. No one pays that. "That is the rate," Sarah said coldly. "If you don't like it, you are free to move your house elsewhere." Item 2. Sarah continued, her finger moving down the page. "This is the painful part. Under the original ground lease terms, the tenant is responsible for all property taxes. However, since the previous owner of the structure was also the grantor of the trust, the taxes were paid directly. Now that the structure has transferred to a third party, a readjustment clause has been triggered. You are responsible for the immediate repayment of deferred tax benefits associated with the land usage for the last 7 years." She tapped the bottom line. "That comes to a total of $500,000, Sarah said. "Also due immediately." Veronica made a sound like a dying animal. $500,000. It was a quarter of the cash settlement I had just given her. Combined with the rent, she was looking at a bill of nearly $600,000 just to stay in the house for the first 30 days. "And if I don't pay?" She whispered, tears spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks. Sarah smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. If you fail to remit the full amount within 30 days, the trust will exercise its right to seize the improvements to satisfy the debt. That means the trust will repossess the house, the garage, the pool, and everything inside it. You will walk away with nothing, Veronica. Less than nothing, because you will still owe the legal fees for the eviction. Veronica looked at Richard Sterling. "Help me," she pleaded. "Richard, do something. Tell them they can't do this." Richard was pale. He was stuffing papers into his briefcase, his hands shaking. He knew the law. He knew he had been outmaneuvered. He knew that any judge looking at the trust documents would uphold the claim. He had committed malpractice by not checking the title, and he knew his career was flashing before his eyes. I need to review the documents," Miss Clark, Richard stammered, backing away from the table. We will be in touch." He turned and walked away, leaving his client alone in the ruins of her victory. But the final blow didn't come from the lawyers. It came from the gallery. The tennis instructor, the boy with the bleached hair and the linen suit, had been watching the entire exchange. He had heard the numbers. 60,000 a month, 500,000 in debt. He had heard that the mansion was a house of cards. He looked at Veronica. He looked at the tears streaming down her face. He looked at the invoice on the table. He did the math. He stood up slowly. He didn't go to her side. He didn't offer her a handkerchief. He checked his reflection in the glass partition of the gallery, smoothed his hair, and walked toward the exit. "Chad," Veronica called out, her voice shrill with panic. "Chad, where are you going?" Chad didn't look back. "I think I left my phone in the car," he muttered, pushing open the heavy courtroom doors and disappearing into the hallway. He wasn't coming back. The gravy train had just derailed and he was jumping off before it went over the cliff. Veronica was alone. Truly, completely alone. The husband she betrayed was standing against her. The son she discarded owned the ground beneath her. The lover she bought had walked out. The lawyer she hired was fleeing. The house she stole was a trap. She looked at me one last time. Her face was a mask of absolute horror. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't won. She hadn't escaped. She had walked willingly into a cage and locked the door behind her. The color drained from her face, leaving it a sickly gray. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Her hands clawed at the air, as if trying to grab onto something solid, but there was nothing there. She screamed. It was a high, piercing sound of pure despair that echoed off the high ceilings of the courtroom. And then her knees gave out. She crumpled to the floor in a heap of expensive black silk and gold jewelry. The bailiff moved forward, calling for a medic. Sarah stepped back, avoiding the falling woman with a look of distaste. I watched her fall. I watched the woman who had terrorized my son collapse under the weight of her own greed. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a heavy sense of completion. The balance sheet was finally zeroed out. The debt was paid. I turned to Sarah. "Send the bill to her hospital room," I said. "And make sure Arthur files the lien on the cars by 5 o'clock. I don't want her selling a Porsche to pay the rent." Sarah nodded, closing her briefcase. "Consider it done, Harrison." I walked away from the commotion. I walked away from the woman on the floor. I walked toward the door where my son was waiting. The air in the hallway was fresh and cool. It smelled of freedom. The land belonged to Leo. The future belonged to Leo. And for the first time in a long time, I could breathe. The pepperoni pizza from the corner shop was greasy and lukewarm, the cardboard box stained with oil sitting on our wobbly laminate table, but after the sterile atmosphere of the courtroom, it tasted like a Michelin star meal. We were back in the cramped apartment, the air conditioner still rattling in the window, the faucet still occasionally dripping, despite my best efforts, but the heaviness that had permeated the air for the last 2 weeks was gone. It had been replaced by a strange electric calm. Leo sat across from me, holding a slice of pizza with one hand and scrolling through his phone with the other. He wasn't looking at social media. He was reading the news reports about the court case. The story had broken online. The headline read, "Malibu socialite evicted from own home in shocking legal twist." He put the phone down and looked at me. For the first time in months, the shadows under his eyes seemed lighter. A small, hesitant smile played at the corners of his mouth. "You are a scary genius, Dad," he said, shaking his head. "You planned that for 25 years. You knew she would do this." I took a sip of my Coca-Cola, the bubbles stinging my throat pleasantly. "I didn't know she would do this, Leo," I corrected him gently. "I hoped she wouldn't. I hoped she would be the partner I thought I married. I hoped she would love you the way a mother should. But in my line of work, you don't build a skyscraper without accounting for earthquakes. You don't hope the ground stays still. You build a foundation that can survive the shake." Leo picked at a piece of pepperoni. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Does she really have to move the house?" I wiped my hands on a paper napkin. "She has two choices," I explained, leaning back in the cheap metal chair. "She can pay the rent and the back taxes, which we know she cannot afford. Or she can try to sell the house to a third party." Leo frowned. "But who would buy it if the rent is $60,000 a month?" "Exactly," I said, pointing a finger at him. "No one. No sane investor will touch a property with that kind of carrying cost and a hostile landlord. She will list it for $15 million, then 10, then 5. It will sit on the market for months, bleeding her dry. Eventually, she will be desperate. She will be facing bankruptcy. She will have to sell it for pennies on the dollar just to get out from under the debt. And who will buy it?" Leo asked, his eyes widening as he saw the endgame. "Your trust will buy it," I said. "Arthur has a standing order. When the price drops below $1 million, which is basically the scrap value of the materials, the trust will step in and make a cash offer. We will buy back our own house for a fraction of what I paid for it. And since the trust owns the land, the ground lease issue disappears the moment the title transfers to the trust." Leo let out a low whistle. "So we get the house back, and we keep the money you gave her because she has to give it back to pay the taxes." I nodded. "In theory, yes. By the time the lawyers and the taxman are done with her, she will be lucky to walk away with enough for a used Honda." She wanted to strip us bare, Leo. Instead, she stripped herself. Leo looked down at his hands. "It is brutal," he whispered. "It is justice," I said firmly. "But listen to me, Leo, and listen closely." I waited until he looked me in the eye. "This money, this house, this power you now hold as the beneficiary of the trust. It is not a toy. It is not for buying sports cars or impressing girls or looking down on people. You saw what greed did to your mother. You saw how it ate her alive." I tapped the table for emphasis. "The income from the ground rent until we buy the house back will not go into your pocket. It goes into a sub-account for your education. After that, any surplus goes to the Hector Vance Foundation for homeless families. You will not see a dime of discretionary spending money until you graduate college with a degree and a job. You will drive this truck. You will work summers. Do you understand?" Leo didn't argue. He didn't complain. He looked at me with a maturity that hadn't been there yesterday. He had grown up in that courtroom. He had seen the face of the devil, and he had seen the sword of justice, and he understood the difference. "Understand, Dad," he said. "I don't want to be like her. I want to be like you." I felt a lump in my throat that no amount of soda could wash away. "Don't be like me, son," I said softly. "Be better than me." I waited too long to act. I let her hurt you because I was trying to keep the peace. You be stronger. You stand up for yourself sooner. Leo picked up his can of Coke. He held it out across the table. "To the ground beneath our feet," he said. I picked up my can and clinked it against his. The sound was tinny and hollow, not like crystal champagne flutes, but it was the best sound I had heard in years. To the ground beneath our feet, I repeated, and to knowing who owns it. We finished our pizza in comfortable silence. The apartment was still ugly. The view was still a dumpster. But it didn't matter. We weren't staying here. And we weren't going back to the mansion either, not really. We were going forward. I looked out the window. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I thought of Veronica probably waking up in a hospital room right now, realizing that her life was over. I felt a moment of pity, just a flicker, and then it was gone. She had made her choices. I looked at Leo. He was laughing at something on his phone, a genuine teenage laugh. He was safe. He was protected. He was going to be okay. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For the first time in 25 years, I didn't have to worry about the foundation. I didn't have to worry about the lease. The contract was fulfilled. The debt was paid. I smiled a small, private smile. Let the world think I was a broken old man. Let them think I had lost. I knew the truth. I had just closed the biggest deal of my life, and the profit wasn't measured in dollars. It was sitting right across the table from me, finishing his crust. Life, I decided, was going to be just fine. Harrison's story teaches us that true power is silent. Veronica chased the glitter of assets but ignored the foundation, proving that greed makes you blind to the ground beneath your feet. In negotiations and in life, the person who speaks first often loses, but the one who prepares decades in advance always wins. Real wealth is not the mansion you display to the world, but the legacy you protect for your children. Never mistake silence for weakness, because while the loud are busy celebrating their temporary victories, the wise are quietly owning the land they stand on. If you enjoyed seeing justice served cold, please hit that like button to support the channel. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of karma striking back. Let me know in the comments, would you have waited 25 years to spring the trap? See you in the next story.